page 53,
Ayin Aleph.
Amud Aleph, side A, 53A. I think we got all the way to the bottom. I think that's where we ended, right by the bottom. So let's go over a few of the points that we mentioned on Friday. Now, I should also mention that these are, if anyone learns the laws of Havdalah in Shulchan Aruch, you'll find them very enjoyable because you've just learned almost all the Gemaras about Havdalah. So we've gone through all the sources. So now, you pick up a Shulchan Aruch, a code of law, a summarized code of law. You go through the laws, you'll see, that's what we learned, on Thursday, and that's what we learned on Tuesday. You'll see the halachas, it'll go much smoother. You'll understand the reasons behind it as well. So the Gemara that we learned mentioned, number one, that there was an argument between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel if they bring a fire to the Beis Medrash, and do people recite the bracha individually, or should one person recite the bracha for everyone? So Beis Shammai said each person should recite the bracha individually, and he was worried about the fact that there's going to be a big interruption of Torah study. Beis Hillel said one person recites the bracha of everyone, B'roiv Am Hadras Melech. This concept is used for other areas as well, that we want a large amount of people as a big honor to the king. So Beis Hillel says it applies here as well when it comes to the bracha of Havdalah. Now, one of the things we see from this little piece of Gemara is that there are times when you recite the bracha on the fire separate from the Havdalah blessing. Because really, in truth, it's not connected. The Havdalah is one bracha, and the fire, the bracha on the fire, is not necessarily connected to the bracha of Havdalah. The bracha on the fire has to do with Saturday night. Hashem created fire, and therefore we commemorate that, and now we're permitted to use fire. So this is like an opportune time to. It feels like it's something new. It's like just created. So we thank Hashem for the creation of fire. So
Rebbe,
yes.
when we don't use zeish, we don't make a bracha.
Right. There are times that you don't recite the bracha, but even when you do when you do use the fire, it's not 100% connected to Havdalah. And at some point, the rabbis connected it, but there are times if you don't have a fire, you skip it. If you get a fire afterwards, you do the fire later. If you have a fire before and you don't have wine for Havdalah, but all you do is have fire, you recite the bracha on the fire.
Yes, I'm only saying that the proof is that when you don't need to, you can make a Havdalah without a fire altogether. They're not linked.
Right. The only thing is, I don't know if it's 100% proof. What I'm saying is because, like, let's say it might say Yom Tov. If it was after Yom Tov, so you don't use the fire. But the reason you don't use fire is because that Havdalah doesn't demand fire. But maybe the Havdalah Saturday night demands fire. And what I'm saying is, no, even that doesn't. It doesn't demand fire. Because you could theoretically make Havdalah without fire, and the fire is not really part and parcel of the Havdalah. It's really connected to the creation of the fire. Might say Yom Kippur, maybe it's more connected to Havdalah. Might say Yom Kippur, because after Yom Kippur, you're really reciting a bracha, not on the creation of fire at all. Nothing to do with the creation of fire. And might say Yom Kippur, after Yom Kippur, the fire is a bracha having to do with the fact that regular Yom Tov, you can use a flame. And on Yom Kippur, you can't use a flame. So now we're separating we're separating from Yom Kippur to the weekday, and we're emphasizing that the flame is now permissible, part and parcel of Havdalah. So it would seem that Yom Kippur would be different, but Shabbos, the Havdalah is not part and parcel of the fire is not part and parcel of the Havdalah, and it could be done afterwards. And that's the case here, where they're doing the fire at a different time than the Havdalah, and there's an argument, Beis Shammai, Beis Hillel, what the appropriate way to do it would be. Now, I just saw in the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch, he brings down, they're sitting in the Beis HaKnesses on Saturday night, and they brought them fire. Lo yavarchu alav, they should not recite the bracha. This is in the code of law, that they shouldn't recite the bracha, each one individually. Rather, one person recites it for everyone, and they fulfill their obligation. And even though, if each one would do it individually, they would not interrupt their learning so much, because if they all have to answer to the one person reciting Havdalah, then they have to be mevatel, they have to interrupt their learning until everyone is quiet and listens. Nevertheless, there is a hidur yoser, it's a better beautification because of Baroi Vam Hadras Melech. So this is what it's brought in the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch. I believe the regular Shulchan Aruch probably says the same thing. It's this is, of course, this is an argument Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. And yes, Echad Mavarech L'Kulam. It's in chapter 298 in the regular Shulchan Aruch, paragraph 14. It says the same thing. One person recites the bracha for everyone, and the Mishnah Berurah adds over here. Interesting. The Mishnah Berurah adds that if a person already said the bracha Bari Miyari Ha'esh, he could recite it again for his family. That's an interesting question. And they bring in the Alter Rebbe says that it's a machlokes. It's not so simple to recite that bracha for everyone. But in any event, in other words, if you already said that bracha, can you have other people in mind? So, is it considered a birchas hanenin or not? Or is it a birchas hamitzvos? So, the one opinion is it's a bracha on a mitzvah, and even though you don't need to recite the bracha for yourself, but it's thanking Hashem for the fire on Motzei Shabbos, and therefore it's not a berachas hanen, and it's not a bracha of benefit, that if you don't get benefit, you can't recite the bracha for someone else if you're not benefiting, or you don't need this bracha. But some argue on that and say that since it's not such a mitzvah that you have to run after, which we'll soon see that the fire is not a mitzvah that you have to, bend over backwards to fulfill. So therefore, it's not similar to berachas hamitzvahs, that because they're an obligation, you can fulfill the obligation for someone else. But because it's not such an obligation, so it's questionable if you could fulfill the Bari Miyari Ha'esh for other people. Now, there is a big question about Havdalah for women. And Havdalah for women is it's a complicated thing. In other words, a person makes Havdalah for himself, then he wants to go home and recite Havdalah for his wife. Is he allowed to? And it's a big machlokes. There are different ways of understanding Havdalah. If Havdalah is a biblical obligation based on Shabbos, the laws of Shabbos, so we know for the laws of Shabbos, women are obligated just like men. And therefore, a man could be mitzi, could have in mind his wife, even if he fulfilled his obligation already. On the other hand, there are opinions that Havdalah is rabbinic. And being that it's rabbinic, there are, within that opinion that it's rabbinic, there's two ways of understanding it. One way of understanding it is that it's based on the biblical idea of honoring Shabbos and remembering Shabbos. And therefore, the rabbis established the law just like the biblical obligation, and women would be obligated. So both of these two views would say women are obligated. One is it's biblical, so they have an obligation to honor Shabbos when it comes in and when it leaves, and those are obligations on women as well. Just like Kiddush is an obligation on women, Havdalah also would be an obligation, or it's a rabbinic obligation, and they say that Havdalah is connected to remembering Shabbos and the holiness of Shabbos, and therefore the women are obligated on a rabbinic level similar to the biblical level. These are two views that would say that women are obligated in Havdalah. But there is a third view, and that view is that the obligation of honoring Shabbos, remembering Shabbos with Kiddush is biblical only for Kiddush, and it doesn't apply when Shabbos ends. And the Havdalah is a rabbinic law, and it's based on the concept of lahavdil bein kodesh bein choil. It's based on a different rule. It's not connected to the laws of honoring Shabbos. And according to that rule, if it's not connected to the laws of honoring Shabbos, then women would not be obligated in it because it's a time-limited mitzvah. And therefore, it's being that it's not connected to keeping Shabbos, honoring Shabbos. It's something on its own. The rabbis established you have to separate weekday from holiness, and therefore it would not be an obligation on women. So there's a question. So do women make Havdalah if they're not married? What do they do if they're single? Does a woman recite Havdalah? It's an argument. According to some opinions, yes. According to other opinion, no. So the conclusion is that women are allowed to recite Havdalah for things that they're not obligated to. For example, can women shake the lulav? Yes, and we encourage them to. They're allowed to recite a bracha on things that they're not obligated because it is, it's one of those mitzvahs that it's like, if they want, they could fulfill it. So because they could recite a bracha on lulav, they could recite a bracha on shofar, they could also recite a bracha on Havdalah. But you can't go after you already said Havdalah and say another Havdalah for them because they're not obligated. And the only way you would be able to cover someone else is because you have an obligation to help other people that are obligated. This woman is not obligated, according to some opinion. And therefore, you can't go and recite Havdalah for them if you're not obligated. If you're obligated to say Havdalah, for example, you didn't recite Havdalah yet, then of course you go and recite Havdalah for women as well. You recite for everyone. Your whole household is included. You're included. Everything is fine. But if you want to hear Havdalah first, you already fulfilled your obligation of Havdalah. Then you're gonna come home. Oh, I'll make Havdalah for my wife later. That's a problem because of this view that holds that Havdalah is not connected to Shabbos specifically. In other words, not connected to the honoring Shabbos, the laws of Zacharas Yom HaShabbos, the Kadshay, to remember Shabbos and make it holy. It's not connected to that mitzvah. Therefore, they would not be obligated in this time-limited mitzvah. Women are not obligated time-limited mitzvahs. You can't go and make Havdalah for them. They can recite Havdalah for themselves. Now comes the $1 million question. And the $1 million question is, so do they recite the bracha on, when they say Havdalah for themselves, do they recite the bracha on the fire? So they don't recite Havdalah. It's questionable if they recite Havdalah or not. And so they don't have a man say Havdalah for them if he already fulfilled his obligation. But can they, when they say Havdalah, what bracha do they say? Well, makes sense. They say the Borei Pri HaGofen. They say the Hamavdil. They could say the Besamim bracha because the Besamim bracha, the spices bracha, is on benefiting from the spice. No problem. And it's also for Shabbos, it's for the soul that left, the extra soul of Shabbos. But what about the bracha on the fire? The bracha on the fire, remember what we just said. We just learned the Gemara here that it's not 100% connected to Havdalah, the fire bracha. So would it be for a woman to recite the fire bracha, would that be an interruption? Because it's not specifically connected to Havdalah, and women are not obligated in the fire bracha. Even men are questionable even men aren't exactly obligated, but for women, it's a bracha that is dependent on time. If you miss Saturday night reciting the bracha for fire, can you say the fire bracha on Sunday morning? If you didn't recite Havdalah last night, do you say Havdalah Sunday morning? So you say Havdalah, but you don't say the bracha on the spices, and you don't say the bracha on the fire. Why not? Well, because did Hashem create fire on Sunday morning? No. Hashem created fire. Hashem showed Adam Arishan about fire on Saturday night. So the creation of fire was Saturday night. Therefore, we recite Havdalah, the bracha, fire, Saturday night, but Sunday morning is too late already. You don't recite the bracha of fire. You say Havdalah now. Let's say someone forgot Havdalah last night. They could say Havdalah in the morning. They say the bracha on the wine, and they recite the bracha of Hamavdil ben Kodesh l'choil. You would recite Havdalah Sunday morning. You could recite it Sunday night. You could recite it Monday, but until Tuesday night, you can say Havdalah. But the thing is that you cannot recite the bracha on the fire because the fire is limited, time limited. So here we see a Gemara that the Havdalah is not necessarily connected to the bracha on fire. And women, especially, would then not be obligated. And even if they're obligated in Havdalah, it would seem surprising that they should be obligated in the bracha of fire, which is not even really connected to Havdalah. At some point, it got included in the Havdalah blessing, at least for men. But the women, it's a time-limited mitzvah, and it's questionable even of a mitzvah status. So therefore, questionable about women reciting the fire bracha. So it's interesting. The Alter Rebbe in his Shulchan Aruch, he talks about the women reciting Havdalah on their. Talks about this issue about what should they do. So he says women could recite Havdalah on their own, even if they're exempt, because they could recite a bracha on all mitzvahs, and that's not a problem. And he says, however, a man should not listen to a woman's Havdalah because there is a view that it doesn't work. Now,
Wait, Rabbi, you didn't answer the question. And I had the problem because I used to go to shul and listen to Havdalah, and whatever I had in mind, I didn't have in mind, and I used to come home to my wife. And then when we learned this, I stopped doing anything in shul, but no one ever told me at the time that I had to omit the Borei Priya, that she had to omit a Borei Priyesh when she did Havdalah for herself.
So so this is the story. The Alter Rebbe, I don't see anything clearly emphasizing the Borei Miyori Ha'esh for a woman. I think I saw something earlier, but I don't see it now. But the Biur Halacha in the Mishnah Brura, if you want to look it up, Isaac, it's the last Biur Halacha in chapter 296. Is it the last one? 296. Yes, the last one in chapter 296. So the Shulchan Aruch says women are obligated in Havdalah just like they're obligated in Kiddush. And some argue, and the Ramah says, therefore, they should not recite Havdalah themselves. They should hear Havdalah from the men. Now, the Biur Halacha says, look in the Magen Avraham, that writes that it's obvious that they're allowed to recite the bracha for themselves on besamim and on the wine, because these are blessings of benefit. And the Magen Avraham does not bring the blessing of the fire, because the blessing of fire is not about benefiting. it was established on the creation of light. Because if it was about benefiting, then every time you benefited from fire, you should say such a bracha. So therefore, he says, even if women are obligated to Havdalah, it's questionable if they're obligated in the blessing of the fire, because Havdalah is connected to the Shabbos, the mitzvah Zohar, and it's connected to Shabbos. And even if you want to say it's rabbinic, they establish it similar to Shabbos. So you could say maybe they're obligated in Havdalah according to that other view. However, the fire is connected to the creation of fire on Saturday night, which is not connected to the Shabbos, and therefore it's a time-limited mitzvah, and it's not connected to the honoring of Shabbos. And therefore, who says that they're obligated? And you can't say that since they established in the Havdalah the bracha of fire, it becomes one, because that's not so. Because you could recite the bracha on its own, and you don't even have to run after getting fire, so it's not 100% a mitzvah. Maybe since preferably you're supposed to do it together, maybe it's okay, but it seems better not to recite the bracha on. They're not chayev in the Berachos Haner according to everyone. So he wants to conclude in the Bir Halacha that this is the Mishnah Brura's book of in-depth discussions. It's called the Bir Halacha. So he concludes that a woman who's reciting Havdalah would not say the bracha on the fire. So that is connected to our Gemara here, because we see that the fire is not so part and parcel of the Havdalah. And because it's not part and parcel of the Havdalah, and it's not connected necessarily to Shabbos, it's connected to the fact that fire was created on Saturday night, there's room to say that it's that you shouldn't recite the bracha of fire. Now, there is one sefer called the Shmira Shabbos Hilchasa that says that better if they say the bracha of the fire after Havdalah, he wants to say, because at least it won't be an interruption. If there is any questions, it won't be an interruption. So if they want to say the bracha on fire, they are allowed to do brachas on mitzvahs that they're not obligated, but don't interrupt the Havdalah with it. Say it afterwards. So that's the way he explains. But I think the common custom is, and this might interest you, Isaac, I think the common custom is they just skip the bracha of fire. I think that's the common custom. If they recite Havdalah of their own, if I'm not mistaken, they just skip the bracha on the fire. Yes.
And that's even if it's done Motzei Shabbos at the right
even
time.
Even Motzei Shabbos, for women only, a women only.
Thank
Havdalah.
you.
I
Yes.
just wondered if you come home and you did already the Havdalah, if you can do Havdalah for your wife without a blessing.
Without a blessing, then what do you gain? What does she gain?
She can do the blessing on the Besamim.
What is that going to do? The Havdalah is the main blessing. It
completes the Havdalah.
No. The Besamim is almost nothing compared to the Havdalah blessing. So she has to do the Havdalah. She can say it in English.
Oh, okay.
But if she reads Hebrew, let her read the Hebrew. But and she can use grape juice, if she doesn't want to use wine, or mix the grape juice with wine.
Yeah.
If you want to be very machmir, she doesn't want to drink wine, but you don't want to use grape juice because there are questions about grape juice. You could squeeze the grapes. And you can make your own grape juice. That's 100%.
She likes wine.
She likes wine. So you're all set to make your own Havdalah. Just she cannot fulfill the obligation for you.
Okay.
Because there's a question about that. It's wouldn't fit wouldn't work. Okay. So that basically touches on these the questionable fire, the bracha of fire that if women recite it or not. And the obligation of women for Havdalah, we've touched upon it. We are going to come across the other Gemara that we're quoting, and that Gemara, I guess, is a very important Gemara to mention about: are you obligated to run after fire if you don't have fire, to what extent do you have to bend over backwards to get fire? Do you have to go down the road to ask people if they have a match, or should you just recite Havdalah? So we're going to see, surprisingly, the fire is not such a mitzvah. You don't have to run after it. It's interesting because we talk about like tzitzis. It's not exactly a mitzvah to wear tzitzis, but the Gemara says if you don't run after it, Hashem, if there's punishment in the world, it could affect someone if they don't wear tzitzis. So even though it's not 100% obligation to wear tzitzis, but it would be advisable to wear tzitzis. But for the Gemara here, when it talks about the fire, mitzvah fire, this is not considered. It seems like it's less important than the other it's not a mitzvah saseh. It's not a positive mitzvah, at least biblical. It's even it's more of a tradition rather than like a mitzvah even. But interesting how the Gemara words it. We'll soon see. Okay, so so we learned this Gemara about the argument Beis Shammai Beis Hillel, and then the Gemara said that the reason for Beis Shammai that each person should recite the bracha on their own has to do with bittul Beis Medrash. It'll cause a bittul of the Beis Medrash. It'll cause people to waste time from their learning, and therefore he says better to have each person individually cite the bracha. But we said the halacha follows Beis Hillel, and the concept is that it's more important to have Beroi Vam Hadras Melech, to have a large crowd is more beautiful for Hashem. Then we brought a brisa that Rabban Gamliel was very careful, even one word to say in the Beis Medrash, which interrupted, was not appropriate. Even if someone sneezed, they wouldn't say marpe, which means like, may God bless you, you should be healed. And because it's bittul Beis Medrash. Then the Gemara mentioned about the blessing on the fire and on the besamim of a mace, of a deceased person. And the Gemara said that what is the reason that you don't recite a bracha on the fire? It's because the fire by a person who's deceased is to honor him. And because of that, it's not meant for light, it's meant for honor. Besamim, the purpose of the spices by a deceased person is really to remove the bad smell. And so therefore, again, it's not meant for goods for smell, it's just to remove a negative smell. Now, the Gemara says, Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav, Rav Yehuda Amar Rav says that you can tell if it's meant for honor, if a fire is meant for honor, or if it's meant to give light, if they use the fire even by day. So Rav Yehuda Amar Rav says if the deceased person there, they put the fire there. In other words, they have like a yard site candle with the deceased person, and when they take the deceased person, they take this candle with him by day. So it shows that the fire is a flame for honor instead of for light, and therefore you would not recite the bracha on it. But if they only use that yard site candle, that fire, for at night, then it shows that it's in order to give light, and then you could also recite a bracha barem yari ha'esh because it's meant for light. Now Rav Huna says the summum of a bathroom, the spice of when they spray some spice for bathroom, that's meant to remove the smell, and therefore you cannot recite a bracha. It's not meant to smell this good smell; it's meant to remove a negative odor. Now, so the Gemara asks, what about in a store? How could you say a bracha in a store? There's a brisa that says about a store. You go into a store. That's not meant to when you go to a spice store. It's not meant to smell. It's meant to put into people's food when they get home. And so it's not meant for you to be smelling. The Gemara answers, no, that spice is meant for you to smell because they want you to smell it, and you're going to buy more. If you smell it, you're going to like, this is a really good. This tastes what a good black pepper. This going to be so good in my soup tonight. I have to buy extra. This is fresh, and then I'm going to buy some there's curry and that it smells so fresh and so you smell it, you got excited over what you're gonna buy more. So therefore, it's meant the store owner is putting it there. It's meant for you to smell, and therefore you could recite the Borei Mina B'Samim on that spice because it's meant to smell as well. It's meant for your food, but it's also meant to smell because it's going to bring him business. Now, then the Gemara says that there is an issue of smelling a incense that was used for Avodah Zarah. So it depends. If you're in a place where you have the smell of some type of incense, it smells good, and you want to recite the bracha for B'Samim. So the halacha is that it depends if it's majority Yidden, majority Goyim. And we explained that it has to do with the case where you can't tell the source. If you could tell where the source is coming from, you should check, of course, where is the source coming from? Is it a kosher source or a treifa source? Is it from a Avodah Zarah or not? Now, but Rabbi Yossi argued. He says, even if it's Rabbi Yossi said, again, we're talking about we don't know where the source is from, and Rabbi Yossi says that even if it's majority Yidden that live there, you can't rely on majority because there's also a minority of Yidden that use incense for kishuf, some type of black magic. So he says, so the Gemara asks, so it's a minority that use it for black magic, for kishuf, for some type of sorcery and things like that. So if that's only a minority, so therefore it shouldn't be an issue because we assume you go after the majority, that's the rule in the Torah. Achari Rabbim, Lahatos, you follow the majority, therefore it should be fine. If majority are Yidden, goodbye. It's good. In other words, we're all set. You have your B'Samim. The Gemara says no. The Gemara asks, how does it help if you have the minority of Jewish women that use the spice for kshafim? It's only a minority. Does everyone use it for kshafim, for kisha, for black magic? The Gemara answers no. It's only a minority that uses it for kshafim, and there's a minority that uses it for clothing. So this Gemara itself mentions that there's a minority for clothing, and so the Gemara says it comes out that you have a majority not for smelling purposes. Now, what does that mean? That you have two minorities and you have a third minority of Goyim. So you add three minorities together, then you have what comes out is it would be an issue. What happens if you just had two minorities? So the way the Gemara is understanding is two minorities, maybe you would make it half and half, and that would be, you would be allowed to recite the bracha on it. Now, the question we had on Friday, we did have a question. On Friday, I ended with a question, and that was, if they use spice to make your clothing smell very good, shouldn't that spice be a spice that's meant for smell? It's used for your clothing. It's going to smell good. So what's wrong with spicing incense that makes the clothing smell good? That's exactly what we're looking for. We're looking for a spice that's meant for smelling, and that you should be able to recite a bracha on. And our Gemara makes it like, oh, that's impossible. You cannot recite a bracha. There's no question about such a spice. You cannot recite a bracha on such a spice. How could that be so obvious? What's wrong with that spice? That's a perfect spice. It's meant for smelling, right? They're putting this cologne on the clothing, or they're inside the smoke that goes from the incense. It goes into the clothing. That's the way they used to do it. Actually, they would burn incense and put the clothing right near it, and all the smell would go into the clothing, and it would have such a great smell. So I would think that should be perfect for B'Samim because it's meant for smell. And our Gemara makes it like, oh, that's a minority this, a minority that. It's not meant for. It's not kosher. You can't use it. that's exactly what we want. So I saw in in halacha, and this seemingly would answer the question, that it's brought in the laws of the brachas of smell that you cannot recite the bracha on when they smell the clothing, when they make a spice for clothing, you cannot recite a bracha on it because you're not smelling the essence, the source of the smell. You're only smelling the smell without the source. In other words, what do we do on Saturday night? It's a Shabbos. We smell the besamim. We smell the spices. We smell the source of the smell. If there's just a smell of besamim in the room, but they moved the spices out. So let's say they crushed cloves in the room and said, okay, make Havdalah, I'm leaving. And they took the cloves and went out. You would not be able to recite the bracha besamim on that because you need to recite the bracha on the source. If they just made that smell and if they put that smell in the clothing, and you can't recite a bracha on the clothing, and that's not because that's not the main source of the smell. It's a smell without an ikar, without a main source. Now, what about smelling the actual incense? Could you smell the incense? The answer is no also. Because that incense is meant to give a smell to the clothing, not for people to smell. It's meant for the clothing. So because it's not meant for people to smell, you can't smell the incense, and you can't smell the clothing if the incense isn't there. So if the clothing is moved to a different room, of course, you're not going to be able to smell the clothing. So what could you smell? You could smell clothing if the incense is right under it, and you're smelling the clothing with the incense, with the source there. It would seem that should be okay. But if so the Gemara here that's mentioning that if it's used for if it's a smell for the clothing, that would not be acceptable. So the point is that you're smelling the incense over here, and they're trying. Then it's not meant for smell; it's meant for the clothing to smell good. So because of that, it's not considered for a good smell. In other words, if you're smelling the clothing, it doesn't work. And if you're smelling the incense, it also doesn't work because the incense that you're smelling is not meant for smell. It's meant for the clothing to smell. So therefore, that's why our Gemara says that gamer behem as a kalim for the clothing, that incense is not kosher for smelling to use for bisamim for the bracha in Havdalah. Now, the final little piece over here of Gemara said that if a person is going, that's actually where we're up to, the bottom line. We're up to the bottom line of 53a. 53a, the bottom line. And the Gemara says, Tanu Rabbanan. Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbis learned, Haya mahalech b'shuk shel avodah zarah. If a person was going in a marketplace of idol worship. So, Nisratze lehariach, if he had in mind to smell, hareza choite, he is considered to have sinned because you're not allowed to benefit from avodah zarah. So actually, there was one little piece that I wanted to emphasize before this, and that is that we mentioned this Gemara that the Reb Chia bar Abba, the name of Rabbi Yochanan, said that people would go, if a person went from on Erev Shabbos from Tiberia, and the person was walking there on Erev Shabbos, and on Motzei Shabbos he's in the city of Tzipori, you do not recite a bracha on the smell because we assume that they are spicing up their clothing. They are giving a smell to their clothing, and that's why that's why you're smelling it. It's not a smell that's meant for you to smell. It's a smell that's meant for the clothing to have a good smell. And therefore, it's not you cannot recite a bracha. And I mentioned on on Friday that it had to do with there was a custom to accept Shabbos early in Tiveria and end Shabbos late in Tzipori. And because of that, the people used to go on Erev Shabbos, they would be in Tiveria, and on Motzei Shabbos, they would be in Tzipori. And that's what he's mentioning, that both of these places don't just smell. You have to find the source of the smell and see if it's meant for smelling. And then you could recite the bracha on smell. So what comes out is you don't recite a bracha on the smell unless it's meant for smell. Now, and then the Gemara said this, Gemara, that you're not supposed to, if you're in a place of Avodah Zarah, you shouldn't have in mind, of course you got to breathe, but you don't have in mind to enjoy the smell of the Avodah Zarah. And now we turn the page 53b. 53b, we are on the last side, the last amud of chapter 8. And the Gemara says, brings from the Mishnah, V'ein mevarchen al haner ad sheyeyosu. You don't recite the bracha on the light of the ner, of the fire, until that you benefit from it. Now, Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav, Rav Yehuda Amar Rav says, Lo yeyosu mamish. Yeyosu does not mean that you actually benefit from it. Ella, rather, kol she'ilu oimed b'karev, as long as you're standing close to it, u'mashtamish la'ira, and you're using the fire, the light, you're using the light, ba'afilu b'richok makom. And even if you're far away, but if you would be standing close to it and you could benefit from the light, so that's good enough. So you're far away, but if you would be close, that would be fine. V'chein amar Rav Ashi, and so does Rav Ashi say, b'richok makam shaninu, if you're far away, it's also fine. Again, keep in mind, you have to see the flame. You have to be able that if you were close, you would be able to benefit from the light. Meisvei, the Bnei Yeshiva, the scholar, the students of the yeshiva, they asked a contradiction. If a person had a candle that is hidden in his chest, by his chest. Now, it seems like maybe it had to do with the coal. Maybe that was their heating system. But somehow he had a candle hidden. Panos, or in according to some, this means, panos it means a lantern, and it's made out of glass. Some say that it can't mean glass because, in other words, there is a debate over here in this Gemara, is if you see a fire in glass, would that be considered seeing the fire? Or are you seeing it through something else? Is that ruin the ability to say a bracha on it? And that boils down to the case that I mentioned, and Ezra had mentioned that there were times when they didn't have a fire, they would use the bulb. But this is the question here, and it's based on this word, panos. If this word means it's a lantern, what type of a lantern does it mean? If it means a glass lantern, then what's going to come out is that it's a bulb, you cannot recite a bracha on it. But if it means a lantern that you can't see the light clearly, like it has maybe lattice around it, that would be the way the Rashba learns. It has some type of little holes that maybe you get some light, but you don't see the actual flame. So that's the way the Rashba learns. Then according to that, if you saw a light in a bulb, it would be a kosher fire for Saturday night. So again, this is the source of a big debate, if you could use a fire in a light bulb, not a fluorescent. I'm not talking about a fluorescent light bulb. I'm talking about an actual filament that has a fire in it, but it's covered over by glass. And we're not talking about a frosted light bulb. It has to be a light bulb that you actually see the fire. Would that be acceptable? So it's based on this Gemara over here. What does panos mean? So let's translate it that it means a glass lantern. So if you have a glass lantern, or you saw a flame, but you didn't benefit from its light, or you benefited from its light, but you didn't see the actual flame. You didn't see the flame. You cannot recite a bracha until you see the flame and use the light. You cannot recite the bracha until you see the flame and you benefit from the light. Now, it is good. I understand what it means that you use the flame, you benefit from the flame, and you don't see the shalheves, you don't see the flame, but you benefit from it. How could that be? Mishkachasla could be the example, could happen. The kaima b'keren zavis, you're at a sharp corner, so there's light that's coming from the corner, but you don't see it because it's blocked by whatever is at that corner, and it's coming from the other end, it's coming from the other street, but you are benefiting from light. For example, it's dark out at night. So you're seeing light coming from behind from another street, but you don't see the actual light. So that's very obvious. But if you see a flame, but you don't benefit from the light, how could you have such an example that you're seeing a flame and not benefiting from light? Lav dimerachaka, shouldn't it be talking about that you're far away? And it comes out, you can see a flame, but you're not benefiting from the light. And the case was that you're not allowed to recite a bracha. So this is a kasha on Rabbi Yehuda Marav that he said you don't have to actually be there. You could be far away. As long as if you were close, you would benefit from the light. But if you're far away, you're not benefiting from the light, but you see a flame, but you're not benefiting from light because you're far away. So it would seem that this brisa proves Rabbi Yehuda Amarav wrong. The Gemara answers no. The Gemara says loy, no. The brisa is not talking about such a case. Rather, what is it talking about? Going the amya the azla, that the flame, let's say it's a coal, it's getting darker and going away, meaning the flame is slowly going out. And since it's weak, even people that are close to it are not benefiting from it. And this is what with the brisa is saying you cannot recite a bracha. So the brisa said that there are numerous cases where it's not a kosher fire for Havdalah. What are the cases? Well, if it's hidden, the fire is hidden, so you're getting warmth from it, it's somehow hidden by your chest, or it's hidden inside a lantern, which we said there's two explanations. One would be that it's glass and you're actually seeing through a lens, and that would be a problem. Or it's not glass, but it's covered over, and it's covered over with metal or frosted maybe or something like that, and you're not seeing the actual flame. Or you saw a flame and you're not able to benefit from it, or you're benefiting from it, but you don't see the flame. That none of those you can say a bracha on. Einay mevarich. You can't say a bracha on any of those cases. What is the case where you can say a bracha? Only in a case where you see the flame and you're able to benefit from it. So the Gemara thought that this proves that if you're far away from the flame, that is not acceptable. The Gemara says, no, that's acceptable if you're far away. But if you would be close, it would be okay. That's fine. Where is it a problem? If the flame itself is a very weak flame, it's almost not giving off light. It's like you had a coal that was hot. It was red hot. Now it's slowly becoming ash. And so therefore, there's almost no flame left. And since it's very minimal, it's not giving off. You can't benefit from the light. and therefore it's not going to be kosher to say a bracha on it. Tana Rabban and the rabbis learn. If you have gecholim, coals that are burning, mevarchan aleim, you can use them if they're, of course, if they're lit for light, you could use them. Now, oimamais, but if they're going out, they're not burning, they're not flaming. Ein mevarchan aleim, you cannot recite a bracha. Hechi dami leichashos. So the Gemara asks, how is it? What is the case where they're flaming? That how much flame does it have to be? And you could say a bracha. Amar Rav Chizda says, Kol she'ilu machnis l'soichan kisam. Any case where you would, if you would stick into these gecholim, these coals, a kisam is a splinter, some small piece of wood, v'doilekas, and it will light up me'eleha on its own. That is considered a kosher flame, and it's called a shalheves, a flame that you could recite a bracha on. Now, otherwise, it's a problem to recite a bracha boirei mi'orei ha'esh. The Bnei Yeshiva, the students asked this question: what is the proper wording? How do you spell this word? Oimamais. Oimamais with an aleph, or oimamais with an ayin. So the Gemara says, Tashema, come in here. Rav Chizda bar Avdimi said that there's a verse in Yechezkel that uses a similar word, amamuhu, arazim loy amamuhu began Eden, that the arazim, the cedars, they didn't lessen their appearance, their unique appearance, began Elikim, in the garden of Hashem, and that means amamuhu means lessens its appearance. And they use the verse there uses an ayin. So you see, aimamais means it weakens, its appearance weakens. In other words, the flame is weak, and that is it's really an ayin, not an aleph. And now we have the final view that Rava says, Ye'osu mamish, you actually need to stand close to it. So you actually benefit, you're able to benefit. It doesn't help if you're far away, because you actually have to be near it to be able to benefit from the flame. It's not enough to be far away. Okay, we're going to stop here, and to be continued. That's Hashem tomorrow.